First, this is essentially, it's a new mine. It's a new open pit mine. It will go in next to the underground mining operation. Both mines will operate side by side in BHP Billiton's plans for decades to come. So you get the continued impacts of Roxby. As you are familiar with Roxby, Roxby started in the 1980s. Everything that's been wrong with Roxby will continue to be wrong with Roxby, but it will get very much larger and worse. It's the plan of the company that the scale of the operation will vastly increase. The scale of mining, the scale of production of radioactive tailings, the demand for water and energy to drive the vastly increased volumes that come with open pit mining and come with lower grade mining, lower grade ores. And the company and the government call it an expansion. The environmental impact statement says Olympic Dam expansion. And these are public relations terms. These are terms to try and make the broader community convinced that this is going ahead regardless. They're just expanding within their existing rights and operations behind the fence as approved. And it really is a fundamentally different project to have a new open pit mine. The largest open pit mining project in the world is proposed there. Vast impacts of any aspect of that scale of mining, and doubly so when it's a radioactive ore and when it's making us further complicit in the uranium nuclear fuel chain. Both the copper and the uranium markets are fundamentally important to BHP Billiton's interest in this mining operation. The open pit would make Roxby the 4th largest copper producer in the world. They have plans to make it much larger again, larger plans than what you were consulted on in the environmental impact statement. The company actually applied to the federal government for a larger mine than what they actually assessed in the public consultation. They only produced documentation talking about an operation to the scale of about 750,000 tonnes of copper product in total a year. The company were originally thinking of 1 million tonnes a year. Since then, they've been thinking about, well, 1.2, 1.4, perhaps 1.5 million tonnes. They have long-term plans for Roxby. It's tended to be a multi-decade mine. And they've only really talked to you about initial stages and initial smaller scale of likely impacts over the longer term. So there are fundamental questions about due process in that, in terms of a government assessing something that doesn't really convey honestly to the public what is the long-term company plans and the scale of the impacts and the operations. And whether it is that the impacts on fragile water resources and ecological systems, whether it's in the British Basin and the Mountain Springs, whether it's in the Oak Spencer Gulf and the ecology and the fishing industry and the cuttlefish breeding ground, how do those impacts scale? If you build a project up from 750,000 tonnes to 1 million or 1.2 or 1.5, what happens to those scale of impacts on those ecological risks? How far do you swing the dial in those ecological risks if you vastly increase the scale of the mine over time from what the public have been consulted about? It's certainly intended to be the world's largest uranium project. It would overall increase uranium production from 4 to about 19,000 tonnes of uranium a year. Now, we're already a big player. South Australia is already complicit in the worst of the nuclear risks around the globe. We already are a key supplier of the uranium that produces high-level nuclear waste in reactors and produces plutonium, fissile material, dual use for bombs or for boiling water. Nuclear reactors can boil water, that's true. There are far safer and more sustainable ways of doing so. And regardless of the climate change debate globally and in Australia, we have fundamental direct responsibilities to the uranium trade that we should not be involved in this. We shouldn't be counterseen any company, any private interest, any vested interest or profit margin involving us in vastly increasing those risks and our complicities in those nuclear risks around the globe. And that there are fundamental changes with the project, not just to an open pit operation from underground, so you have both mines together, but to date, Roxby has processed its copper on site. It's sold a copper product from that site. In the open pit mining project, it's intended that Roxby will produce a concentrate. So virtually all of the production of copper that will come from the open pit will go and be processed overseas. It will go out as a concentrate. It will go out as a uranium-infused bulk copper concentrate. A few thousand tonnes of uranium would go out in what is said to be an initial 1.6 million tonnes of concentrate. So that's a radioactive powder. There are extra risks and concerns about bulk radioactive transport. There are risks and concerns about the rights and interests of communities, traditional owners through Central Australia, because that radioactive uranium-infused bulk concentrate would go up by the rail through Central Australia, through Alice Springs, through many people's country. It would go out through the Port of Darwin. The community in Northern Territory are going to be faced with that radioactive imposition, as well as the likely increased transport of most of the yellowcake through Northern Territory rather than out of Port of Adelaide. And so far there is only one market country for that uranium-infused bulk copper concentrate. That's China. When Prime Minister Howard did his uranium sales deal with China, he didn't even contemplate selling uranium concentrates. It's not part of the treaty for sale of uranium to China. So there are actually 3 sets of government approvals involved in Roxby Downs. There's the South Australian approval, which we hear about in the media. Mike Graham wears his hard hat. The Liberals trying to compete with him to be more pro-mining, to be more in favour of BHP and Roxby. Both the South Australian government and the federal government have virtually got separate, full rights of say of what happens at Roxby Downs in the proposed new open pit, under what conditions it might go ahead, if it does go ahead. They are both those governments are fundamentally responsible for effectively the types and the scale of impacts that are involved in this proposal. And there are quite key contrasts between what the company plans and the impacts from that, and in theory what the governments could require of them. Now one change is that you don't go ahead with the mine whatsoever, that you acknowledge that the nuclear impacts of such a large uranium project, the impacts of producing such large amounts of radioactive tailings are unconscionable to be involved in that. The next level of government decision is, well, if the mine's going ahead, under what terms may it go ahead? They could decide to run that mine as a copper mine. They don't have to sell uranium at Roxby Downs. There's no technical or economic reason why Roxby sells uranium now. And as I may have time to go on briefly, when Fukushima happened, Roxby should have stopped selling uranium. You know, they have an obligation to that no uranium and no other radioactive waste should ever leave that site. If that means no mine, or if it means that in an interim it goes to a copper-only operation, they should have stopped uranium sales immediately following Fukushima, that nuclear disaster. The Commonwealth have those powers in the long run. They have the policy and the powers, they have it under the Constitution, corporations' power. They can do these things in Australia if they chose to do that. If they felt the public power to overcome the vested political and corporate interests, we could do that in Australia. The third set of approvals, we have Mike Graham, we can largely assume what his decision is going to be. It may come out this week. We expected the Roxby decision well before now. Lately it was expected last week. All of the stars seemed to align for Mike Graham and the feds and the company to announce the approvals last week. They would, to suit Mike Graham's schedule, he's going to be leaving in a fortnight from office as Premier. He may announce the decision of approval next week and introduce an intention that Mark Pennell will talk about the week after in the 3-day period. And they may well rush some of those matters to suit a political agenda so that one person can wear a hard hat and say, well, this is what I give to you. I give you the legacy of the world's largest open pit, the legacy of responsibility for the highest level of uranium production and sales in the world, the legacy of responsibility for producing the world's largest radioactive tailings pile ever in the globe. They're civil society issues that we need to be able to get a handle around at some stage if we're ever to claim we really are a democracy. Now, the federal government has a separate power because it's a uranium mine. They have full power under the federal environment legislation to place a decision and conditions on that operation. For instance, the federal and the state government could take a different set, a divvy up of different set of priorities and conditions of approval between them. The state could say, well, we want to have a key say about what might be done through energy production and greenhouse impacts at Roxby. I'll return to that briefly. The feds could say, we're not satisfied with BHP's plans to design this mine to leak radioactive waste. It doesn't make sense under the powers of the Environment Protection Act to protect the environment to allow any proponent to design a mine to leak vast amounts of radioactive waste. It doesn't make sense, the feds could say, to allow them to dump the radioactive tailings out of the ground, to make them dispose of it back into the pit as is required in the long term at the Ranger uranium mine. Why should the federal government, a Labor federal government, with very strong discretionary powers to use in the federal parliament, why should they drive down environmental standards in Australia to even less than they are now in terms of how Australia manages radioactive liquid waste and radioactive tailings long term? Should we have to do worse than we already do to suit BHP Billiton's profit margins and mining interests? Because they don't want to pay to manage their radioactive waste. They don't want to have to pay to line the tailings pits. They don't want to have to pay to dispose of the tailings back into the pit. They don't want to have to take any responsibility for the uranium that goes overseas. When it leaves Australia's shores, they're hands off for all those nuclear impacts, for the unresolved high-level nuclear waste, for the risk of the weapons and waste risks that come with both governments and state players, the state players through the governments, but also now the high risk of terrorism around the world. Nuclear power plants are pre-placed nuclear disaster potential. They are pre-placed radioactive weapons. We've seen the potential that can come through lack of preparedness and ill design and natural events in Japan. If you put that into a developing world context and you add nuclear terrorism and the potential for war, well, what sort of responsibility are people taking then for those inherently dangerous and unacceptably dangerous nuclear risks? that BHP will make profit out of. Unnecessary profit, because they know full well they could run that project as a copper project and leave all the uranium and the radioactive waste on site.